The US tariffs on China now total 145%.
I did a 90-day pause for the people that didn't retaliate, because I told them if you retaliate, we're going to double it.
Breaking that at Hermes Boutique will cost you 38,000 USD.
Nobody is getting off the hook, especially not China. That was the promise, not just a slogan. The administration's announcement, a 145% tariff, was just the beginning. The administration outlined plans to bring semiconductors, the electronics supply chain, and fentanyl under a broader national security review. China, the administration argued, would face consequences for long-standing trade grievances. America would rise bigger, better, stronger than ever. But here's the problem. The phone to negotiate still did not ring. Talks on fentanyl, frozen. TikTok, no progress. Taiwan, off the table. And instead of China calling, the most prominent voices coming to Washington now are concerned CEOs, cautious investors, and once loyal allies asking the same question. What happens when the tariffs don't bring surrender, but silence? The only voices calling Washington now? Nervous CEOs, rattled investors, allies quietly looking for alternatives. What if the tariffs didn't trigger China's retreat, but America's isolation? In capitals across Europe, Asia, and Latin America, the reaction was not immediate confrontation, but careful recalibration. What started as a bold show of economic force quietly evolved into a global reassessment of Washington's role in a multipolar world. As tariffs climbed and rhetoric intensified, once promising diplomatic dialogues unraveled, the US-China fentanyl cooperation talks, previously seen as a humanitarian bridge, were suspended. Efforts to align on artificial intelligence governance lost traction. Even long-standing strategic dialogues over Taiwan, conducted through sensitive and often discreet channels, were disrupted by the growing cloud of uncertainty surrounding American intentions. Rather than galvanize a coalition, the escalation left many partners uneasy. Europe began speaking with a more independent voice. Key EU leaders, wary of economic spillovers and domestic political backlash, chose to maintain open commercial ties with China. In Southeast Asia, countries long courted by Washington looked to Beijing for infrastructure, investment, and predictability. For them, China was increasingly seen not just as a rival power, but as a reliable economic anchor. This realignment wasn't declared. It unfolded quietly, persistently, as trade delegations bypassed Washington and new alliances took shape in backroom forums and regional summits. It happened when regional blocs like ASEAN deepened their own internal trade networks, hedging against external shocks. And it happened when developing nations sought loans and supply deals from China rather than wait on unpredictable US offers. Meanwhile, global business leaders adjusted. CEOs no longer planned around a stable, rules-based system anchored in Washington. Instead, they planned for volatility. Corporations diversified production out of China, but not necessarily back to the US. Supply chains migrated to Vietnam, India, and Mexico, places seen as safer bets in an age of tariff threats and political brinkmanship. Stock markets, sensitive to every tweet and tariff schedule, became barometers not of economic fundamentals, but of geopolitical improvisation. The fallout also took root in perception. Washington's credibility, once grounded in consistency and long-term alignment, appeared increasingly reactive. Allies were left wondering, would today's deal be tomorrow's headline reversal? Would a tariff exemption last 90 days? Or vanish with a single press conference? In the absence of strategic clarity, even close partners began crafting contingencies. The silence then was not absence, it was a repositioning, a quiet restructuring of alliances, trade routes, and political expectations. And it left the US in a new kind of isolation, one not built on hostility, but on uncertainty. The trade war was born from a desire to reshape an imbalanced economic relationship, confront persistent trade deficits, and reassert domestic manufacturing. On paper, the aims seemed clear: to address grievances long voiced by policymakers, business leaders, and trade unions. But as the policies rolled out, sudden, sweeping, and often without warning, the lack of a coherent roadmap became apparent. The administration promised leverage. What emerged was ambiguity. From the start, the question loomed: was the endgame negotiation or decoupling? The two paths demand entirely different strategies. One requires engagement, alliances, and flexibility, and the other demands rigidity, endurance, and a willingness to endure economic shock. But Washington appeared to oscillate between both, sometimes in the same week. One day it offered exemptions on electronics to protect US tech firms. The next, it threatened sweeping restrictions on semiconductors as a matter of national security. This volatility didn't just confuse markets, it destabilized trust. Within the US government, conflicting priorities created internal gridlock. Some advisors called for a hardline decoupling strategy, cutting China out of supply chains regardless of cost. Others pushed for targeted pressure combined with multilateral diplomacy. Instead of resolving that divide, policy unfolded in fragments. The result was a mixed message to the world. Forceful but inconsistent. Bold but uncoordinated. Strategic but often reactive. Internationally, this lack of clarity reverberated. Traditional allies, accustomed to US leadership grounded in structure and process, struggled to adapt. Trade partners began asking not just what the US would do, but why. Was there an overarching vision? Was the pressure calibrated toward a specific outcome? Or was it improvised based on daily political wins? In this environment, coalition building, a vital ingredient for meaningful global trade reform, faltered. Opportunities to form united fronts on digital governance, intellectual property protections, labor standards, and climate-aligned trade frameworks were repeatedly sidelined. Without America anchoring the dialogue, others filled the space. China, the EU, and regional blocs like ASEAN increasingly set their own terms. Ultimately, what emerged was not a unified US trade doctrine, but a patchwork of pressure points. It left allies guessing, competitors adapting, and American businesses navigating a landscape where predictability, a cornerstone of economic planning, had become a scarce commodity. While the US adopted a strategy of pressure and disruption, China pursued a parallel strategy built on patience, subtlety, and global positioning. Its response was not loud or confrontational, but deliberate and layered. In the face of US escalation, Beijing focused not on retaliation, but on recalibration. Its approach emphasized strategic optics, appearing calm, measured, and ultimately more dependable. China's regional diplomacy intensified. Senior leadership visits to Southeast Asia were not simply symbolic. They resulted in concrete agreements across infrastructure, digital economy, and energy cooperation. In Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia, China positioned itself as both investor and integrator. Through its Belt and Road framework and expanded free trade networks, Beijing offered economic predictability where Washington offered disruption. For many governments juggling development goals with rising geopolitical risk, China's presence felt less like a gamble and more like a guarantee. At the heart of Beijing's response was supply chain leverage. Without formal threats or headlines, China imposed targeted controls on critical materials, particularly rare earth elements, permanent magnets, and components essential to electric vehicles and defense technologies. These measures reminded markets of China's embedded role in global manufacturing, subtly shifting the costs of confrontation back onto US companies without triggering open escalation. By limiting supply at strategic choke points, Beijing sent a quiet message. Decoupling comes at a price. Equally significant was China's messaging strategy. Instead of engaging in a rhetorical tit-for-tat, Beijing leaned into the narrative of stability. State media emphasized partnership, dialogue, and mutual respect. Chinese diplomats highlighted their country's role as a responsible global actor, especially in contrast to the volatility perceived in American trade policy. This narrative found an audience not just in developing economies, but among traditional US allies seeking to de-risk their exposure to global tensions. What made China's response effective was its restraint. It did not mirror every American move. It chose moments carefully, calibrated reactions, and focused on reshaping perceptions. In doing so, China managed to position itself as both resilient under pressure and increasingly central to the global economic system. Not because of retaliation, but because of consistency. This was not a sprint. It was a long game, and Beijing appeared prepared to play it. By avoiding direct escalation, China positioned itself as a predictable economic partner. In an environment of volatility, this narrative gained traction among nations seeking policy continuity. At home, the effects of the trade war were most acutely felt not in policy briefings, but on production floors, in boardrooms, and across farms and warehouses from coast to coast. As tariff schedules expanded, US businesses large and small scrambled to adapt. For many manufacturers, the costs of key inputs, especially electronics, machinery, and materials, rose sharply. Some attempted to pass these increases to consumers. Others absorbed the losses, reducing margins, cutting back on hiring, or shelving expansion plans altogether. Sectors once promised a renaissance under trade reform, particularly industrial manufacturing and agriculture, faced an increasingly complex landscape. Farmers, already operating on tight margins, found long-standing export relationships upended overnight. Crops once destined for Chinese ports sat in silos as buyers looked elsewhere. Temporary relief packages were issued by the federal government, but uncertainty lingered. many in rural economies began asking, what is the long-term plan? Multinational corporations were not spared. Some of the US's most globally integrated firms found themselves caught between compliance and competitiveness. In response, many pursued dual strategies, diversifying production across multiple countries while rethinking reliance on single-market export models. The broader trend was clear. Resilience replaced efficiency as the driving principle behind supply chain restructuring. Perhaps most consequential was the shift in perception, both at home and abroad, about the reliability of US trade policy. Businesses began pricing in political risk alongside commodity prices. International partners, once confident in America's stability, voiced growing concern over unpredictability. What would be taxed next? Would exemptions hold? Could a signed deal be undone with a single statement? In capitals across the globe, these questions had consequences. Some countries chose to fast-track trade pacts with other large economies. Others began diversifying diplomatic channels. And a few, even traditional allies, started hedging. Signing side agreements, building regional ties, and preparing for a future where the US might not be the only pillar of economic order. In the end, the domestic effects of the trade war were not limited to spreadsheets or balance sheets. They altered expectations, eroded assumptions, and reshaped how American policy is understood, not just by economists, but by ordinary workers, international partners, and political leaders around the world. This isn't just a trade war. It's a gradual reshaping of how America's global role is perceived. Tariffs were supposed to be tools of negotiation. Instead, they've become symbols of confrontation. Rather than pressuring China, the result may have contributed to a growing sense of isolation for the US. They have introduced new challenges for key sectors such as manufacturing. And rather than boosting global confidence, they've fractured it. Beijing's strategy appears effective, not because of open confrontation, but due to Washington's fragmented signals and perceived unpredictability. Some observers warn that overlooking diplomacy as a key form of leverage could carry long-term strategic costs. Can the US regain clarity and restore global trust before strategic ambiguity hardens into lasting isolation? Drop a comment for more breaking news.